Well, welcome to this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. We are going to discuss medical assistance in dying today. The Quebec government has just tabled a bill that will allow people to give prior consent for medical assistance in dying if they have Alzheimer's or another illness that would render them legally incapable of giving informed consent later on. So this is a very important development. I've got legislation in front of the Senate right now on that very topic. And the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, of which I was a part, has just released its report. And again, we have called there for the right to an advance request for Canadians coast to coast. So we've gone to the expert, as usual, to have this discussion. Dr. Stefanie Green was one of the first providers of MAiD in this country after legalization in 2016. She's the author of this book. It probably has some other titles now. This is Assisted Dying, a doctor's story of empowering patients at the end of life. And she also is the president of the Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers. These are the medical professionals that have to figure out what all the rules are. So, Stefanie, welcome. Nice to see you again. And you've got a tough job with all of these changes across the country, the Quebec legislation, the new report. You've got to figure out what it really means for those of you who are on the front lines, on the ground.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about that. It can be confusing, and it is a challenging position to be in, for sure.
So where are we? The Quebec legislation, when you've got a province, I guess it's just part of being Canadian, because this is all under the criminal code, which is federal, but the provinces deliver healthcare and things like medical assistance in dying. So how are you reconciling that through your association, your group of MAiD providers?
Well, it's been an interesting journey. As many of your listeners will know, Quebec was really at the forefront of this work in Canada. They did the work, they consulted their people, they had their debates, and really, before the rest of Canada was allowing this federally, Quebec had already considered assisted dying a healthcare act, a soin. Right. And went ahead and legislated how to allow assisted dying in the province. The recent bill that's been tabled is a reaction to some of the experience they've had, and they've really done four significant things in this bill that I think people should understand. I mean, reconciling with the rest of Canada is a whole complication, but it's important, I think, that people understand that what Bill 11 in Quebec does is actually four different things. Number one, they withdraw the criteria that used to require end of life being present for someone to access assisted dying. That was not consistent with the rest of Canada, and the removal of that eligibility criteria is a substantial change in Quebec law that's being proposed. The second thing they did was they now allow nurse practitioners to provide this care well within their scope of care, already recognized in the rest of Canada. So a big change in Quebec to allow nurse practitioners to do the full scope of work in assisted dying. The third thing they did, which I hope will be a precedent for the rest of Canada, but isn't yet, is that they've mandated or suggested that all palliative care hospices must provide this care. It is care for the people, and they can't just opt out because they want to. That's not true in the rest of Canada right now, and I think will be a precedent for the rest of the country to consider, again, this leading way by Quebec. And of course, as you alluded to, that the issue I know you want to dig your teeth into is that Quebec has suggested that they allow those suffering from a serious and incurable illness that leads to an incapacity, a loss of capability to make their own healthcare decisions, to be allowed to make an advanced request for MAiD. And that is something that Canada perhaps will be considering in the rest of the country as well, according to the report that you just mentioned of the Joint Commission.
So let me just start at the last point there, because it is what I'm so concerned about. Yeah. In your understanding of the Quebec bill, then, it is upon diagnosis of something like Alzheimer's or dementia that you would then be able to put in your request then? The runway from diagnosis to actually incapacity could be 6 months or 2 years or 5 years. We all know lots of people that have an ability to make a decision much later on after the diagnosis. What have they said about that?
Yeah, I think the Quebec legislation does require that an advance request can only be made after a diagnosis has
Yeah.
been made. So I think what that does is that does exclude people who maybe would say, if I had a massive stroke that left me incapable, I would want such and such. That really wouldn't be covered under this legislation. This is meant for people who are given a diagnosis of a serious illness like Alzheimer's and then can consider what their future might hold and then very carefully write down and consider what their values are and what they would or wouldn't accept in the future and then make that, give that consent for a future assisted death. So that requirement of diagnosis is in there.
What's always been in the back of my brain about this is, and then we'll get back to sort of the issues at hand, but is really as often as you can and write it down so that when you come to these decisions, people know that this has been a long-standing position and not just a reaction to a diagnosis or to a situation. So, I'm pretty much on the record on this, but people should be doing it themselves.
Well, I think the promotion of advanced care planning in general is something that the Joint Commission has mentioned and talking about these issues and planning in advance. This is a very specific one. I think it's also important to understand that in the Quebec legislation, they've required or they have suggested that we require kind of an objective listing of evidence of suffering that the patient could write down in advance. If you see this, and if you see this, and I'm experiencing this, these are objective things that a competent professional could then assess at a future date. And that requires a lot of forethought. And it does mean that if you don't list something that shows up later, that you may not qualify. So there are some limits to that requirement, but it does require an objective finding of contemporary suffering at the time of the assisted death. And people will debate about whether that is or isn't required or should or shouldn't be, but that is in the Quebec law.
But that's what people have been discussing over the years. If you could sit down and write the list and say, when I don't know who I am, when I don't recognize my family, when I can't feed myself, when I'm incontinent, just so there are parameters to say, it's not the minute after a diagnosis, it's when I don't have quality of life.
Yeah, I think something we shouldn't overlook here, it might be tempting to try to create a list or a checklist, but we could never really imagine all the things that should be on that checklist. I think from a clinician's point of view, I mean, what would be ideal, maybe for anyone's point of view, is not so much a checklist, but a real understanding while the patient still has capacity of what their values are, what their preferences are, what their interests are, so that that's documented in advance, so that can be also assessed in the future. Is this consistent with the patient's values and their preferences? They may not have written out the exact situation, but this seems consistent with what they said was important to them, and these things on their checklist are similar to that. I'm looking at an objective finding of something not quite outlined, but consistent with that value. And I think that would be really helpful.
One of the things that the phrase that is in the Quebec legislation that many of us have found interesting is prisoners of your own body. If you were a prisoner inside your own body, irreversible decline of your health and physical and psychological suffering. You can think of, quadriplegics or people who can't move and express themselves, or ALS or other of those situations, but also Alzheimer's, because you have those moments of clarity, but in the early stages, but perhaps not. So is this prisoners in your own body a kind of interesting concept from the clinician's point of view?
Well, it is. I think that one of the cruelest things we see are people who are, we often use the term locked in, who still have their capacity to make their healthcare decisions, who know exactly what's going on around them, but their body has been ravaged by an illness which has left them, unable to do anything or act in any way independently. That's not really contemplated or covered in this legislation because they talk about the patient needing to have lost capacity to make their own decisions. And so that's an interesting, you might say, omission.
Yeah,
in this
because
situation.
the phrase is used, but it really does capture, I think, the situation that a lot of families deal with, which is we know mom, dad, or brother or sister would not want to live like this, and that it isn't life as they know it. The other point that you notice about palliative care and access, I mean, I come from a rural area. In Saskatchewan, it's hard enough as it is to even find a doctor, never mind facilities. So
Right.
this would allow seniors' homes or old folks' homes to actually maybe also provide this service, because there may not be a home to go to for an elderly person.
Well, I think these residences, these assisted living places, seniors' residents, these are the homes of our
Yeah,
patients, very
yeah,
much so. And so that's why it's such a problem when a facility tries to opt out of offering certain care. The patient doesn't really have a choice. They're not always given a choice of which facility they end up in, whether
right.
it's long-term care or even by choice. And so we certainly clinicians feel these places are the patient's home, and they should have access to care in all of them. And if they are in need of specific care and high-end care, palliative care, there may often only be one in a certain region.
Area, yeah, for
And
sure.
you know, the fact that they can choose to opt out of offering other care is really unfair to the entire populace who has no other choice of where else to go. So I think the idea that Quebec mandates that all facilities have to offer this is exceptionally important.
Well, I actually know of one situation where the couple, the husband and wife, asked if they could use the facilities at the funeral home. The person was going to be cremated, but the partner, the other partner, didn't want this act to occur in their own home because that would be the memory. So they wanted a third location, and the funeral home agreed, and I thought that was kind of an interesting answer too.
Yeah, very creative solution for sure. We've unfortunately had to be creative when there are these kind of these forced transfers out of facilities that opt out. I've seen people have assisted deaths in, well, I haven't personally done one in a funeral home, but I've heard of
Yeah,
several, a camper van, a hotel, a beachfront, private rooftop gardens, a kind of a whole host of creative solutions. In Ontario, in Toronto, they have MAiD House, which is
right.
a nonprofit that is trying to offer space for people to go to in case they cannot, for whatever reason, have their
Yeah.
assisted death in their home. And these kinds of ideas are beginning to crop up in other places.
I want to come back to the larger debate, and of course, we went through this in the joint committee, and we see it in the public debate because it's one of those stories that just, it's got click appeal, I guess, is the only way to say it, which is on the whole question of disabilities. And I can't say often enough, and I'm sure you can't either, that this is a question of choice. Nobody is trying to force this option or procedure on anybody. And in fact, you hear from some parts of the disability community
Mm.
that if they didn't have access to this, that would be the discrimination, that they want the same right as any other Canadian.
Absolutely. I think it's an important concept when we're talking about large groups and communities of people, that they're not a monolith, right? Well,
Right.
Indigenous people are not a monolith. There are
Right.
countless nations in this country, that make up the First Nations. There are countless people that belong to and self-identify with the disability community. They don't speak with one voice, just like you and I speak with two different
Right.
voices. So I
Right.
think we need
Exactly.
to acknowledge that. It's very important. And there are some smaller studies showing that people who are marginalized, there's a study out of the downtown east side in Vancouver, people who are marginalized often consider themselves some of the most resilient people on the planet, that they've had to deal with things. And in fact, they're quite offended by somebody suggesting that they should decide if they do or don't have access to something. They're more concerned with being informed about their options than being pushed into an option. They don't feel they can be pushed into an option. That said, there are certain patients that are especially vulnerable, and we do need to recognize that safeguards need to exist, and
Yeah.
we do need to be careful in our assessments. That is an important role of the clinician's job.
The statistics are interesting, though, as much as they are kept. I know everybody wants a little bit more data, but in fact, people who opt for MAiD are not the most vulnerable, or not the homeless, or not veterans who've been given some bizarre advice from some bureaucrat in an office. It's people over 70 who are in late stage cancer who have been able to inform themselves about their options and have have exercised those options.
Yeah, that's true in every jurisdiction in the world where assisted dying is available. And we can see that data in Europe and the United States and in Canada. We're beginning to see that in Australia and New Zealand. I think it's in a really important point that one of the studies done in Ontario by James Downer and his group showed that of those people who actually received MAiD over a several year course, over 80% of them were already receiving palliative care or had,
Right.
an even higher percentage had access to palliative care. These are patients, as you say, who are predominantly white, well-educated, high socioeconomic bracket with good access to care and an ability to find the care. These are not the marginalized people. Will that change over time as this becomes more available to others, as they become more aware of this option? That's yet to be seen, and certainly our data gathering has become more robust since January 2023. But by far, right now, the data is showing exactly what you mentioned.
Yeah, so it's kind of the flip side of the argument that you hear that this will be used against people who are vulnerable, when in fact, it's really more likely that they wouldn't have access just because of their
We have zero evidence showing that type of abuse or coercion. There's just no evidence to support that. And I can tell you from a personal point of view, just anecdotally, in the 6.5 years I've done this, there's been one case where I felt there was a question of coercion of a patient to move towards this care, and I did not allow them to go through because I had a question about that. I have seen probably 10 times as many of those, of people who have been, I would say, coerced out of accessing assisted dying because of family and loved ones' preferences. And so I think that argument needs to be balanced.
That's exactly the point, because people have, quite rightly and quite understandably, their own selfish needs. They don't want their mother to die or their friend. They want them to hang around. So the motives are good, but the outcome is maybe not what the person themselves wanted. One of the other interesting things that I saw in this Quebec report, or attached to it, is that Quebec is at the global forefront, as you've mentioned, of providing medical assistance of dying, but a higher proportion of people choosing the procedure in that province than anywhere else on the planet. Now, is that because of their thinking about it, because it's considered part of the healthcare continuum as opposed to some other procedure?
It's a great question. I have spent most of the past couple of years trying to describe and analyze why British Columbia had been leading the way, because up until this year, that has been the case. And especially where I work in Victoria on Vancouver Island, we'd been leading the way. But numbers now have changed, and Quebec is definitely at the forefront. I think you've hit on what is the most likely answer. Quebec, a couple of things. The group of professionals, the college that regulates professionals, has been involved in this process from the very early days, and even before it was legal in Quebec, had concluded that that assisted dying is actually medical care. It is health care, and consistent with their professional regulations and guidelines of what a professional obligation would be and responsibilities, that it was in line with that. It didn't contradict that. So the professionals were kind of in line with allowing this debate to go forward. That said, Quebec takes a very careful process where they debate about it, not just in Parliament, but they take it to the people. They have town halls. They have civil discourse. It's a very important part of their process. They've been doing that for a very long time now, 8, 9, 10 years. And with that kind of discussion, robust, in the field, with the people, with the politicians, with the professionals, I would guess there's a much better understanding and comfort with this in a much wider swath of the population than maybe we could claim in the rest of the country. So I think that's probably why that's happening.
And on the island too, you've got wealthier, educated people and more providers, I think, per capita than other places in the country.
I think we do. And again, we have a health authority, which, for all its good and bad that it does, Island Health has been incredibly proactive in its preparation of this care. They did not wait for it to hit them in the face. They saw it coming. So good preparation, a population that fits the demographics of who access is made, and clinicians willing to do the work has been the answer in BC, all of which is probably true in Quebec as well.
Let's just take a moment, if you don't mind, at this point, because I get this question almost every day of the week. Okay. And if you look at the public opinion polls, you'll know why, because the public is way ahead on this issue, right? They want access, they want advance requests, they want all of these things.
They
Like
do.
87, 91%, depending on what poll you're looking at. So what is your best advice to people? Because we do have these differences in provinces across the country. What if you're sitting in your living room talking to your wife or husband about this? What do you do?
Great question. I think before I answer the detail of that, I think it's also really important to contextualize that despite all this debate and discussion about the complications and where we might be going, we know from data from last year in 2021, 97 point, I think 8 or 0.2%, over 97% of all cases of MAiD in this country are for people whose death is reasonably foreseeable, and they're all what we call track 1. These are patients, classically, over 65% of them have cancer. We know that they're on a trajectory towards death, and that's really primarily who we're serving in this country. So what's a person to do? If a person is sitting in their living room and thinking this might be something they want to investigate or know more about, there's actually quite a few options. The ideal answer would be that they would have a primary care clinician that they could go to and ask about this, and that every one of those clinicians could answer those questions. That's not exactly true for all Canadians today, very unfortunately. So if that's an option, please do that. If that's not an option, pretty much everywhere across the country, there are now MAiD care coordination centers in every province, in every health authority, where you can simply call, email, or even fax someone who's knowledgeable about this possibility and have a conversation with them about whether you want to meet with someone, a clinician, to talk about your eligibility. That is available everywhere. There are generally provincial lines or regional lines. You can self-refer to clinicians who, like myself, have websites and make themselves available to the public. So self-referral, referral through your own practitioner, provincial care coordination systems. There's quite a bit of information. Government sites, even federally, you can get information about assisted dying in Canada.
So literally go online and say, I need more information about medical assistance in dying.
Yeah, I would write your province name and assisted dying, and you should get your answer right there.
And there are forms that you can actually get to start the process because that is all part of the end of life care continuum, which is talk about this with your kids so they're not surprised, or talk about this with your husband so he's not.
Well, ideally, yes, it'll be a robust discussion from the very earliest stages. Some people may choose to investigate this information on their own privately. And then if they decide that it's something they really want to pursue, then maybe that's the time to bring in family. But that's a very individual decision, very personal decision.
But it is still one of those issues where and I just went through this in my own family. It actually takes a death in the family for somebody to sit down and start talking about, well, what do you want? What do you want? What about cremation? What about burial? What about, all of these things. It's funny that at this age and stage in our society where it's still almost taboo.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, to be honest, it's one of the reasons I wrote my book. I really think people need to have discussions about death and dying. I think we need to understand and embrace that death is a part of our life. And if we're willing to have that conversation, no matter what we think about assisted dying, if we're just willing to enter into the conversations about end of life, that will be a great service to all of us. I really wanted to talk about death and dying as a whole, as, end of life options in general and in particular, and then an assisted dying is a very specific wedge within that. And I think all of that is really one of the main reasons I wrote that book, and I want to stimulate those conversations.
Well, and I'll just show you again, this is assisted dying, and these are actual stories of situations that Stefanie found herself in, about how the family was dealing with it, about how the patient was dealing with it, and it really does offer insight into how to go about this discussion. So that's worth a read for sure. A couple of other questions before I let you go. And you and I've had this conversation before, which is, given the polls, given the state of the public mind, what is taking us so long? Why are governments so afraid to ask. I always use this. Usually when there's a parade, you see politicians running to the front of the parade. The parade is already formed. Why are they so reluctant?
I'd say there's two things. First of all, it has been over the last 30 years a fundamental shift in how our nation's population thinks about end of life. And I think that work was done over decades. Now people are really ready. Government works slowly. These are major changes. I think they need to go step by step. I think that they have. I have to say the government took a very bold and important step in 2016, and they've made another step in 2021. And I think they're going to continue to take those steps. And the population would want it to go quicker. Careful, cautious progress is not a bad thing. I personally think that because of legal reasons, Canadians and politicians are dealing with the specific issue of allowing assisted dying for those who have a mental health disorder as a sole underlying condition. That's really a constitutional issue, a legal issue. You cannot discriminate against a group of people based on their diagnosis. So the discussion and complexities around that particular issue, I think, have been all encompassing for the last few years and have maybe distracted politicians, I would say, from some of the other work they could have been doing, specifically around advance requests, which clearly has the greater majority of support from the Canadian population. So I'd like to think that they will deal with that because that's what the population has elected them to do. But it will be careful and cautious. And I think we're going to see those debates hopefully in the next 1 to 2 years.
Yeah, so we will be dealing with that issue of putting the 1 year delay in for mental illness as a sole underlying cause. That was supposed to happen this month, but now it'll be another year out, and that should give people some time. And even in our own report, the joint parliamentary report on the question of mature minors, I mean, we've kind of put a 5-year time frame around that. Go and get the data. It's hard to get data from young people that, what's the relationship between a mature minor and their parent or a guardian? What if they're on their own? It's another tricky issue.
It is, but I think that data is out there. It's just a matter of highlighting it. I mean, we've had for many years, we've had mature minors, those who are under 18, who have decision-making capacity, especially those who've been ill, who are a little bit more mature, who have a good understanding of their illness and what their options are. We already allow those minors, those mature minors, to make decisions about whether they do or don't receive chemotherapies. We already allow these mature minors to decide whether they do or don't receive blood transfusions if they have religious beliefs that might prevent that. We have precedent for that. We have it for years. We have data on how they deal with these relationships. We have professionals with experience in assessing the capacity of those under 18 to make those type of life-altering decisions. In that sense, we have the data that could allow us to move forward if that is the will of the people and the government. So I think that is a very kind of a shocking conversation that some people aren't prepared to have. But in truth, if we look at data, if we make it evidence-based, if we look at historically what's already happening in this country, that is probably, in my opinion, I would say the least contentious of some of the issues we're going to be facing. As contentious as that statement is, I actually think that is more clear than something like building in safeguards around advance requests that we have no experience with.
Yeah. And it is part of, and I think the interesting thing that you've always done and Quebec is doing through this legislation is creating this healthcare continuum, the life and death continuum, right? This is, we accept in our society DNRs, do not resuscitate orders. We allow people to say, look, if I don't want to come out of this surgery, if I'm not going to have physical or mental capabilities, it's interesting that we can deal with it somehow if there's a crisis and there's surgery tomorrow morning. But if we have longer to think about it, it gets more complicated in our own heads.
Yeah, we certainly do respect DNRs. We respect people withdrawing life-sustaining treatments, people who are on dialysis for, needing that for a life-sustaining treatment. We also allow them to choose to decline to receive that treatment anymore and allow themselves a natural death. I think there's a lot of similarities between these options, and we should address them all with open eyes. Yeah.
Stefanie, it's always so good to talk with you. Stefanie Green, this is Assisted Dying. This is her book, but her important role with the Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors and Providers, the doctors, and we hope nurse practitioners across the country who will be part of this, who are really doing the heavy lifting at the front end and trying to give us all comfort that we're doing this with the good intention and with evidence there to back us. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, great to talk again. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. See you soon. So thanks for being part of the No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen audience. We really appreciate it. If you wouldn't mind, give us a review or a like or a thumbs up. It helps us promote our podcast and make sure that more people can hear it. And it also helps us figure out what topics you like to hear about. And then we can focus on that. So we'd really appreciate it here at No Nonsense.